esteemed panelists. My name is Divya, and in our group we have Mara, Urav, Dhruv, and Maddie. Today, as a group, we will be talking about sports and empathy in children. Our research question is, to what extent does participation in team and individual sports impact the development of effective empathy in children between the ages of 8 to 18? Moving on to the next slide, our sub-questions include, does participation in team and individual sports impact effective empathy in children? Next, if team and individual sports are found to increase effective empathy, which one is more effective in children? Lastly, is there a significant difference between the development of empathy in males and females related to sports? Moving on to the next slide. Our hypothesis is, it is predicted that the participation in team sports and individual sports will have an increased level of effective empathy in children between the ages of 8 to 18. It is anticipated that children who participate in team sports will have a higher level of effective empathy than both those who play individual sports and those who do not play sports at all. But as a side note, children who play individual sports will have an increased level of effective empathy. In the next few slides, my group mates will be talking about the background and the significance.
All right, so moving on to the background information and the significance of the study. So first, we must understand the concept of empathy as a whole. So our team specifically chose to focus on affective empathy, which is the ability to share the feelings of others without any direct emotional stimulation to oneself. So we chose this type of empathy because it fits the conventional definition of empathy that would be the most relevant to our experiment. So empathy is the foundation of healthy relationships and the ability to navigate complex social situations. The cognitive structures that produce empathy are the left ventral striatum, ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, and the supplementary motor area, which also motivates cooperation with others. So moving on to the significance of the experiment. For sports, 60 million children between the ages of 6 and 18 participate in some type of organized athletics in the United States, with a near equal distribution between teen and individual sports. Regarding empathy, deficits in empathic expression in early childhood contribute to psychopathology and have been variably implicated in several clinical conditions, such as autism spectrum disorders, ASDs, and conduct disorders.
Although the benefits of sports are mainly physical, it has also been documented that there are also psychological and personal development benefits. Exercise is also proven to prevent and reduce mental illnesses, such as depressive symptoms, anxiety, and other stress-related disorders. And empathy and teamwork share common denominators, such as interpersonal skills and understanding others' concerns.
Now I'd like to continue with our study design and methodology. We designed our study to be conducted with a cohort of 600 children at the age of 8 years with no preceding experience in playing sports and no physical disabilities who would prevent them from playing sports. We would split this cohort into 3 groups with each 100 males and 100 females. The first group would play soccer over the next 10 years to represent the effects of a team sport in empathy. The second group would play tennis to determine the effect of individual sport in empathy, and the last one would function as a control group and would not be playing any sports. All of the children participating would take a basic empathy scale test at the beginning of the study. Over the next 10 years, children would be required to spend 5 hours a week playing the assigned sport and take the ES yearly. The last test would be performed at the age of 18, and subsequently the results would be evaluated. We chose soccer as a team sport because of a relatively equal interest in it from boys and girls, which would make it easier for us to find participants And also it requires a great amount of teamwork, which will let us observe if there is a difference in the development of empathy compared to a sport which doesn't require as much teamwork. We chose tennis as the individual sport, also because of equal gender distribution, and also because in one-on-one games, it can be played without a team, but it's still an active sport. Because a main reason for children quitting sport is the equipment cost, we decided to cover all of the equipment cost to minimize the risk of children dropping out of the study. Of course, the participation in the study would be voluntarily. We also decided that it is single-blinded and inter-cohort fraternization would be strongly discouraged. Furthermore, each cohort will be gender segregated to better track gender-related differences in the development of empathy.
To test our participants' level of effective empathy, we will be using the basic empathy scale, also known as the BES test. This test consists of 20 questions, which participants will answer on a rank from 1 to 5. The total of all their answer choices will be combined to create their empathy score. Demographics collected with the test include the participant's name, cohort, gender, and ethnicity. And the basic data interpretation uses measures of central tendency, which includes the mean, median, mode, and interquartile range.
Let's discuss the mechanics of this study. So here are a few limitations of our experimental design. The first one is sample size. Counting on 600 people to participate consistently over such a long time frame is very optimistic, and for various reasons, participants may be forced to drop out. Secondly, participants who are often extremely athletic overshadow those with less athletic ability, which could result in resentment and dejection among those participants, which will in turn influence their BES responses. Next, given the inherent nature of tennis and soccer, participants are bound to have sports-related injury over the span of 10 years, and if the injury is serious enough, it may force them to drop out of the study entirely. Finally, we can make sure that our testing environment controls for as many external variables as possible, but we need to acknowledge that participants may have adverse childhood experiences, known as ACEs, outside of the study that could impact their questionnaire responses. Next. So the reason for participant blinding is to prevent children from sharing their experiences with other groups, which, especially in the case of the control group, would skew the baseline considerably. Secondly, being minors, children are unable to provide informed consent. So if the child is uncooperative, they can only cease participation in the study with parental approval. Next, since the study is voluntary, certain ethnicities can be over or underrepresented. This is also influenced by geographic locations. Demographics would be different if we conducted the test in San Francisco versus Nebraska. Finally, in accordance with the Code of Federal Regulations, data will only be released to participants after the conclusion of the study and if they're over the age of majority. If they aren't, the data will be given to their guardians.
Thank you all so much for your time and attention. We hope you enjoyed our presentation.
So I thought this was very well done. Certainly, there are a lot of really interesting points, but I also have some questions. I found the title of the study to be a bit ambiguous. And what I mean by that is you were really looking at two things. You were looking at participation in sports, organized sporting events, but then you also had a non-sport group that was essentially engaging in exercise. Yet the title was focal to exercise only. There was a subtle aspect of what you were looking at here. In other words, is it the social aspect or the cohesive, integrative aspect, the cooperative aspect of sports, or in some cases, even the competitive aspect of sport itself that in some way may be contributive to those measures of affective dimensionality and empathy? Or is it the physical activity producing, for example, a biological state that is therefore amenable to more direct interaction? And there are the possibilities for mechanisms that might do that. So for example, a rise in exercise-induced serotonin and dopamine might have some downrange effects with regard to release of arginine, vasopressin, and oxytocin, et cetera, et cetera. Interesting ideas that you might want to then pull out of that. So I think dialing that aspect in a bit more could be very important to you, as well as focusing also upon whether or not the sport that was engaged was a highly competitive field or was something more of just a recreational thing. So in other words, in some cases, the competitive nature of the sport might provide in-group cohesion, but cross-group competition. So here too, I think there's some really interesting factors that go along with that. The other thing I would suggest to you is that in bringing out some of the ethical, legal, and social aspects, which I think was wonderfully done, when dealing with the vulnerable population, it's important to be able to understand some very subtle issues. And these are the kind of things that I think really make for a good proposal. The idea that these are minors and therefore cannot provide informed consent doesn't necessarily obviate the fact that they can provide informed assent. And there is an ethical issue, and you sort of touched on it, but I think that's something you might want to drill into a little bit more closely. In other words, if the guardian or if the legal adult, perhaps the parent, in this way provides consent, is the child actually obligated to participate? And in fact, the answer is no. Because the child, if the child does not assent to this based upon a number of cognitive factors that could then be evaluated, the conflict between consent of the guardian and assent of the actual research subject creates what's called a second order ethical issue. And there was probably no way for you to know that, but what you did do is step on a proverbial what they call tripwire. So I really like that you brought that out, but I think what that also requires is here too, a little bit more granularity in some of those fine features that you touched on that would make this not only as good as it was, but perhaps even one step better. But overall, content really, really good, focus really, really good. You hit on some really key important points, but the questions I had was suggestive of the kind I would give back to, let's say, a study section or a group of researchers to improve their proposal so as to be more assured that it was going to be highly ranked and therefore more indicative of soliciting funding. So overall, good job. A couple little tweaks here and there, over the top. Over to you, Morgan.
All right, perfect. Ms. Thompson, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. I love the subject, first of all, empathy. Morgan, you mentioned this. What the world needs now is empathy, more empathy. I think it's a very timely topic. So I think you're on a good path there. I liked how well this was organized. I liked how you defined your terms right up front. I was right along there with you, understanding not only what you were doing, but why you were doing it and why it's important. I did have some concerns about the size of the group, 600 students, and you're tracking them over a period of 10 years. So not only are you going to have some pretty massive logistics to handle, but you've also got cost. I know I brought that up in the last presentation also. And you're also saying that you're going to cover the equipment cost for these 600 students who, of course, are going to grow, need new uniforms, need equipment replaced, et cetera, for 10 years. So your funding for this study is going to have to be pretty significant. Also concerned about, for the team sports part, are the participants able to access teams? You're only choosing 1 or 2 students from each state or from maybe looking for volunteers. Do they have access to soccer teams to participate in, not just at that point, but for the full 10 years of the study? So you did mention the dropout rates for students, which is I'm trying to think of anything that I did as a hobby or that interested me when I was 8 years old that still interested me, that I was still participating in at 18. And your interests change so rapidly through that 10-year span. What you didn't touch on, though, was the dropout or turnover rate of your research team. Very few people hold a job for 10 years solid. So you'd have to factor that in too, that the folks who are on your research team when the kids are age 8 are probably going to be a whole different cohort of people at age 18. So all things to take into account. That said, I thought it was a very well done presentation. I think there's a lot of value here. I think this is something that's applicable to almost everybody. So good job.
Perfect, thank you. And now to Ms. Lovelace.
You can hear me now. You guys handled the technical requirements for that remote presenting very, very well. Your slides were creative and effective. You had good font and style choices that allowed for good readability and understanding. Would have liked to see a little bit more eye contact, but your flow and pacing was very consistent and very unrushed. Material is very well organized, and your key points were presented really clearly and concisely. So overall, very well done.
Perfect. And over to Mr. DeFranco.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll echo all the points that have been made. This is a very significant topic and a very significant question. I'm going to go back to the first point that Dr. Giordano made. I also thought that the title was rather ambiguous and almost misleading. And it actually led my mind to think, okay, what is, as Dr. Giordano said, what is the difference between being in physical contact with people and having a lot of exercise and cardiovascular effort going, and then having other group activities or other individual activities that do not require cardiovascular. So you can add another condition or a control of, say, musicians, where they are not as physically involved, and you could, compare your team sports, individual sports, to a team musicians, a band or an orchestra, or individual musicians, a pianist, for instance, and then still have that control group that has no interactions with, either music or sports. So I think it's important to think about, when you have these significant questions, what controls can really flush out your research question and make the study, that much better. But overall, I mean, this is a very significant question that you guys are asking, and your presentation was fantastic. So I applaud you.